If this doesn't scare you, nothing will. America is quietly preparing for something big, and it could affect you. For months now, the government has been quietly activating contingency plans, strengthening military logistics, and restructuring emergency systems. Meanwhile, 40% of the country faces long-term water stress. The grid is failing twice as often as it did 5 years ago, and foreign demand for U.S. debt just hit a 15-year low. These aren't coincidences. These are signals. What almost nobody realizes is that America has begun stockpiling, restructuring, and quietly reinforcing parts of its economy and federal infrastructure in ways that only happen when a nation is preparing for impact, yet the average person has absolutely no idea what's going on or why the government is moving this quickly behind the scenes. If you pay attention not to the headlines, but to the obscure federal reports, emergency procurement filings, and sudden shifts in federal strategy, you'll notice a pattern that should make every American stop what they're doing and pay attention. Over the past 18 months, the government has dramatically accelerated its purchases of strategic materials, emergency fuel reserves, cyber defense tools, rare earth metals, food stabilizers, and emergency communication systems, growing those inventories by as much as 300% in some categories. Federal emergency agencies have quietly increased their budgets for continuity of government programs by over 40%, something that historically happens only when the United States expects a severe geopolitical or economic shock. Even more unsettling, multiple states have begun reinforcing their grid security, fast-tracking hardened transformers, localized power islands, and backup water arrays projects that were stalled for a decade but suddenly became urgent funding priorities. You don't see this level of preparation for seasonal storms or minor disruptions. This is the kind of restructuring a country does when it expects the possibility of major global escalation, sustained supply chain interruptions, or domestic systemic risk that could affect tens of millions of people at once. Meanwhile, intelligence briefings show a sharp rise in foreign cyber probes targeting energy, financial infrastructure, and transportation systems, attempts that increased 623% since 2021. And while officials assure the public that everything is under control, their actions tell a different story. Emergency response drills have doubled, high-level federal continuity tests have tripled, and large corporations with government contracts are being urged to review redundancy protocols. Coded language meaning prepare for potential system fatigue or outages. Even agricultural agencies are adjusting long-term food contingency maps, anticipating disruptions with grain, fertilizer, and water allocation, something that only happens when modeling indicates the possibility of regional scarcity or global instability. The truth is painfully simple. You are not being warned because warnings create panic. But America is moving like a country bracing for the kind of event that shifts the trajectory of a generation. And whether it's geopolitical escalation, financial volatility, or cascading internal failures, what's coming next is big enough that the government is preparing first and informing you last. Strangely, the clearest sign that America is preparing for something massive isn't found in federal documents or military budgets. It's in the behavior of corporations, financial institutions, and ultra-wealthy insiders who are quietly repositioning themselves as if the American economic landscape is about to transform in a way that ordinary people are not ready for. Look closely at what the country's largest private players are doing, not what they're saying. Over the past year, investment banks, energy conglomerates, and major tech firms have begun shifting billions into non-U.S. assets, rapidly diversifying away from domestic markets at the fastest pace since 2007, right before the great financial crisis. Corporate cash levels held offshore have risen 28% year over year, signaling that big institutions expect financial turbulence or policy risk within U.S. borders. Even more telling, insurance companies, some of the best risk forecasters in the world, have started raising premiums for political instability, climate volatility, and cyber disruptions, with some categories jumping 70% in a single year. When insurers prepare, it's because they know something the public doesn't. Meanwhile, private aviation use among corporate executives has increased 34%, not for luxury, but for security. Wealthy individuals are minimizing dependence on commercial systems that could be vulnerable in a widespread shock. And then there's land billionaires and multinational firms buying up rural acreage, water rights, food production facilities, and off-grid infrastructure at a rate unseen since wartime-era preparation cycles. They don't do this for fun. They do it because they see fragility in the system, a housing market that is cracking in slow motion, consumer debt at record highs, and a workforce stretched so thin that productivity has fallen to its lowest level in a century. Combine that with military tensions, global realignment, and internal political fractures, and you get a picture that resembles a pre-event landscape, one where the people with the most information are quietly insulating themselves before the public catches on. Even banks are tightening internal exposure models, predicting elevated volatility through 2027 and quietly raising liquidity buffers to levels not seen since the pandemic. You're not being told any of this because the system stays stable only as long as the public believes it is stable. But insiders are moving their chess pieces. Corporations are rebalancing in silence. And if you think all of that is happening by coincidence, you're not paying attention. America is preparing quietly, strategically, urgently, and the people who will suffer most when the shift happens are the ones who waited to understand what was coming until it was already too late. What's becoming impossible to ignore is how America's technological infrastructure is being rearranged at a pace that only happens when a nation anticipates a large-scale disruption, and the most unsettling part is that almost none of these changes are being openly explained to the public. Behind the scenes, major tech firms, federal agencies, and critical infrastructure providers have begun quietly shifting their priorities toward hardened systems, decentralized backups, and emergency failover networks built for scenarios far more severe than a simple recession or political shift. Over the last year, data center construction has surged by 47%, not for consumer demand, but for continuity computing systems designed to keep core national functions running even if civilian networks fail. At the same time, telecom companies have been instructed to build redundant routing channels and alternative backbone fibers capable of handling massive rerouting loads, the kind you'd see during a widespread cyber attack or national emergency. Even more alarming, satellite communication providers have begun testing encrypted fallback systems that bypass traditional terrestrial networks entirely, suggesting that decision-makers are preparing for the possibility of regional digital blackouts, events where certain parts of the country lose connectivity not for minutes, but potentially for days or even weeks. Cybersecurity budgets across critical pipelines, water utilities, and power distributors have jumped over 62%, and federal procurement documents show an unprecedented spike in contracts for intrusion detection, air-gapped backup systems, and physical hardening of network nodes. That kind of preparation doesn't happen unless experts believe the threat is already inside the perimeter. Meanwhile, AI governance frameworks are being rewritten at breakneck speed. Not because the government suddenly cares about ethics, but because AI has expanded so rapidly into military, financial, and infrastructure control systems that a single compromised model could destabilize entire sectors. Recent internal briefings warn that foreign threat activity targeting American infrastructure has increased sixfold since 2022, and attempts to breach energy networks are now occurring continuously without pause. Yet the public hears none of this. Instead, they're told everything is stable while the architecture of the nation is being quietly fortified for impact. When you see a country investing billions in invisible defenses, digital shields, redundant pathways, hardened sectors, you're watching a nation prepare for something big, something they don't think the public is ready to process, something they expect to hit without warning. Even more telling than technological shifts is the silent transformation happening inside America's military posture, emergency readiness programs, and global defense logistics. Because this level of repositioning only occurs when a country anticipates a major geopolitical or domestic shock that could ripple through every part of civilian life. Over the last 24 months, the United States has undergone one of the most significant strategic repositionings since the early 2000s, but almost none of it has been explained in televised briefings or mainstream coverage. Troop deployments have been restructured to strengthen forward operating bases in regions experiencing rising instability, with rotational forces increasing by 22% across key global choke points. Logistic hubs that were previously used for routine operations have been quietly expanded with fuel reserves, drone hangars, and high-capacity transport aircraft. Federal emergency stockpiles, once depleted by years of neglect, have suddenly been replenished at unprecedented rates, with inventories of medical supplies, energy reserves, and tactical equipment rising by over 300% in some categories. Emergency communication networks are being reactivated. Continuity of government protocols are being updated for the first time since 2011, and classified budget allocations for rapid response operations have nearly doubled. Even more concerning, military analysts report that global tensions have triggered the highest level of strategic alert posture in nearly 2 decades, and wargame simulations conducted in early 2026 indicate that the United States is preparing for multi-theater disruptions that could spill into domestic systems, financial, technological, and logistical. Supply chain vulnerabilities exposed during the last global crisis have prompted the Pentagon to re-engineer procurement channels, pulling manufacturing away from adversarial nations and relocating production into hardened domestic facilities. International allies have likewise begun coordinating more closely with U.S. defense planners, not for routine cooperation, but for the possibility of synchronized global escalation. And while this is happening externally, internally the National Guard has quietly increased readiness cycles. Disaster response units have expanded staffing by 38%, and states have been issued new guidance on civilian continuity planning guidance that implies potential scenarios far beyond simple natural disasters. When a nation shifts its defense, logistics, communications, and emergency readiness all at once, it's not reacting, it's preparing. And if you're paying attention, you can feel it. A tightening, a repositioning, a quiet bracing for a future American life that may look nothing like the one most people assume will continue indefinitely. What's becoming increasingly impossible to ignore is the massive reshaping happening inside America's financial plumbing, the hidden systems of banking, liquidity, credit, and institutional capital that keep the entire economy breathing, and the changes are so dramatic, so compressed, and so secretive that it's obvious the country is preparing for an event far bigger than what the public has been told. Right now, U.S. banks, hedge funds, and central financial institutions are quietly rebalancing their portfolios at a pace not seen since 2007, pulling liquidity out of long-term assets and hoarding short-term cash equivalents as if they expect a sudden tightening or shock to the system. Over the past 12 months, money market fund balances have surged past $6.2 trillion, the highest in American history, a sign that major players are retreating to the safest corners of the financial world. Meanwhile, the Federal Reserve has quietly expanded emergency lending backstops, repo windows, and collateral facilities structures that typically remain dormant unless insiders anticipate liquidity stress, credit freezes, or institutional contagion. Regional banks, still fragile after the failures of several prominent institutions in 2023 and 2024, have begun raising capital buffers to levels unseen in decades, cutting lending to small businesses, tightening mortgage standards, and preparing for delinquency spikes. And they're not doing this because things are stable. They're doing it because consumer credit card delinquencies are rising at their fastest rate in over 30 years. Auto loan defaults have surged to pre-Great Recession levels, and commercial real estate, especially office and retail, is sitting on $1.7 trillion in debt maturities that many borrowers will not be able to refinance at today's higher interest rates. Even more concerning, U.S. Treasury auctions have shown increasing signs of buyer fatigue, with foreign demand dropping to its lowest share since 2010, forcing the government to lean more heavily on domestic institutions and the Fed itself. When a country's debt grows faster than its ability to finance it, it enters a zone of vulnerability that financial insiders monitor with laser precision, and insiders are moving right now. Pension funds are quietly reweighting away from U.S. equities. Sovereign wealth funds are reducing exposure to American long-term bonds. Even corporate CFOs, the most optimistic people in the economic ecosystem, are pulling back investment spending at the fastest pace since the 2020 pandemic. All of these shifts point to one thing. The people closest to the financial machinery of the United States believe the next phase will not be gentle, not gradual, and not something the public is ready for. This is the kind of repositioning that happens before major devaluations, credit shocks, or geopolitical spillovers. Even more alarming than the financial rearrangements is the silent crisis spreading through America's labor force, a structural unraveling so deep and so irreversible that the country is now facing shortages, mismatches, and productivity collapses that can destabilize an entire economy for decades, and most people have no clue how quickly it's happening. While politicians debate unemployment numbers on television, they ignore the real story. America is running out of workers in the places where it matters most. Over 36 million U.S. workers are expected to retire by 2035, the largest labor exodus in American history, and the pipeline replacing them is nowhere near large enough. Birth rates have collapsed to their lowest level in more than 50 years. Immigration patterns have shifted dramatically, and the young workforce entering the market is smaller, more financially strained, and more geographically concentrated than any generation before them. Entire industries are already feeling the squeeze. Healthcare is facing a projected deficit of up to 3.2 million workers. Manufacturing is short over 600,000 skilled employees. Logistics and trucking have shortages so severe that delivery networks are slowing down, and public sector jobs from teachers to firefighters to municipal engineers are experiencing retirement waves that cities cannot backfill. But the real danger lies in productivity. U.S. worker productivity has logged back-to-back annual declines for the first time since the 1940s, meaning the country is doing more work with fewer results, a combination that historically precedes major economic contractions. And then there's burnout. Over 70% of American workers report chronic stress or exhaustion. Gig workers are earning less per hour than they did in 2014, and wages adjusted for inflation have been stagnant for nearly 2 decades. Add in the explosive rise of automation, AI displacement, labor polarization, and the disappearance of mid-skill jobs, and you get a labor market that is fundamentally fracturing. Corporations know this, which is why they're accelerating automation, outsourcing, and restructuring at a pace the public won't feel until millions of jobs vanish at once. Meanwhile, states are begging for workers, industries are begging for trainees, and the government is quietly modeling long-term scenarios where America simply does not have enough people to sustain its economic engine. A country can survive many things: inflation, war, recession, but no nation in history has survived a collapse in its labor force without experiencing a major societal shift. And America is now walking directly into that shift. What comes next will redefine what it means to live in this country. What almost nobody is talking about is how rapidly America's social fabric is tearing apart, and the speed of this unraveling suggests the country is preparing, knowingly or not, for a level of domestic instability that will reshape daily life in ways most people are completely unprepared for. Across every measurable metric, social cohesion in the United States has collapsed to levels that historically precede major national inflection points. Trust in government is at its lowest point ever recorded. Barely 15% of Americans believe federal institutions act in their interest. Trust in the media has fallen to a record-breaking 28%, meaning most people no longer believe what they're told. Interpersonal trust, the basic belief that strangers within your own society will treat you fairly, has cratered by over 40% in the last decade. These are not random statistics. They're the warning signs every sociologist, historian, and intelligence analyst studies when evaluating whether a nation is approaching a period of internal fragmentation. Violent crime may not appear explosive in national averages, but localized pockets in major cities have become nearly ungovernable, with 911 response times in some areas now exceeding 45 minutes. Retail theft has escalated past $110 billion a year, forcing thousands of businesses to close and transforming urban neighborhoods into ghost corridors of boarded-up storefronts. Meanwhile, political polarization has reached existential levels, with over 67% of Americans saying they believe the country is on the verge of a major internal conflict. And the most chilling part? Mental health metrics have deteriorated at a pace never before documented in the United States. Depression rates are at all-time highs, youth anxiety has doubled, and deaths of despair from suicide to overdose have soared past 100,000 annually, a figure equivalent to losing an entire mid-sized city every year. Communities aren't just struggling, they're dissolving. Churches closing, civic groups vanishing, local newspapers dying, social networks shrinking. And into that void comes division, misinformation, extremist recruitment, and deep economic resentment, all the ingredients for volatility. The government knows this, which is why multiple agencies have increased funding for domestic intelligence, threat assessment models, and civil stability monitoring tools quietly. When a nation reaches this level of internal distrust, something big always follows. Sometimes it's reform, sometimes it's collapse. Even more unsettling is how America's resource landscape, water, energy, food, land, and logistical infrastructure is shifting beneath the surface, creating silent vulnerabilities that only become obvious when it's too late. And the country is preparing for these shortages in ways that suggest the stakes are far higher than the public has been told. Water is the most urgent example. Over 40% of the U.S. population now lives in regions experiencing long-term water stress, and aquifers that took thousands of years to fill are draining at rates that scientists describe as catastrophic. The Ogallala Aquifer, which supports 1/3 of America's agriculture, is losing water so quickly that certain regions are already unable to sustain farming operations. States in the Southwest are now considering forced water reallocations, something unheard of just a decade ago. Meanwhile, the electrical grid, decades outdated and strained by rising demand, is experiencing failure rates that have doubled in the last 5 years. Federal reports warn that heat waves alone could create rolling blackouts affecting millions at a time, and grid operators admit privately that modernization efforts are nowhere near complete for what the next decade requires. But food systems are even more fragile. Consolidation among large producers has left entire supply chains vulnerable to single points of failure. Fertilizer costs have jumped over 300% since 2020, farm bankruptcies are rising again, and cattle herds have fallen to their smallest size since the 1950s. Add the growing dependence on foreign imports, especially for staples the U.S. once produced domestically, and the picture becomes even darker. All of this is happening while climate volatility disrupts planting seasons, shipping routes suffer from low river levels, and insurance companies pull out of entire states because the risk is now unpriceable. What most people don't realize is that the government has quietly increased strategic food and fuel reserves, updated emergency rationing protocols, expanded disaster simulation exercises, and revised continuity of infrastructure plans to account for multi-sector simultaneous disruptions. That phrase, multi-sector simultaneous disruptions, should terrify you. It means the government is preparing not for one crisis at a time, but for cascading shortages that hit water, energy, food, transport, and labor all at once. And history is clear. When resources become unstable, societies shift rapidly and violently. What really forces you to stop and question everything is the way America's political and institutional decision-making has shifted into a crisis preparedness stance, because this level of preemptive positioning only happens when leaders believe the stability of the nation itself may soon be tested, and the public has been deliberately kept out of that conversation. Over the past 3 years, the United States has undergone a political transformation so dramatic that most people don't fully grasp what it means yet. The first red flag is the legal architecture quietly being built behind closed doors. Multiple federal agencies have updated emergency executive powers, continuity of government frameworks, and wartime economic authorities, all without major public debate. These updates allow for rapid control over transportation networks, digital platforms, large-scale communications channels, and even certain financial systems if national stability is threatened. At the same time, states have begun strengthening their own emergency authorities, in some cases granting governors expanded powers during civil unrest, infrastructure failures, or coordinated hostile activity. Even more unsettling is the increase in classified briefings held between intelligence agencies and congressional committees. The number has nearly doubled since 2022, and insiders hint that the briefings are significantly more urgent than in previous cycles. The political climate itself is deteriorating at a speed never before measured in modern American history. Confidence in elections is fractured, trust in institutions is evaporating, and polarization has reached a point where nearly 35% of Americans believe political violence may become necessary in their lifetime. That is a catastrophic number, the kind of number you see in countries moments before internal conflict ignites. You can feel it too. The tension, the volatility, the quiet fear that the next election might not just decide leadership, but the direction of the nation's future identity. And politicians know this, which is why they're quietly preparing for contested outcomes, legal battles, mass protests, and potential backlashes that could spill into streets, cities, or institutions. What's even more alarming is how federal agencies have increased surveillance on foreign influence, domestic extremist networks, and coordinated misinformation campaigns, not because they want to, but because levels of digital interference have skyrocketed by over 500% since 2020. America is entering a moment where one spark, geopolitical, economic, or internal, could fracture the already brittle political foundation. And the government is preparing because they know exactly how close the country is to a point of no return. The most shocking truth, the one nobody wants to confront but everyone can feel, is that America is quietly preparing for a fundamental shift in its position in the world, because the era of uncontested U.S. dominance is ending faster than anyone expected, and the changes ahead will redefine what it means to live in this country for the next century. For the first time since World War II, the United States is facing a convergence of global pressures that threaten its long-standing role as the center of global finance, trade, military strategy, and cultural influence. The dollar's share of global reserves has fallen from 71% 2 decades ago to below 50%, with multiple nations openly exploring alternative trade systems to reduce dependence on the U.S. That shift alone would be enough to destabilize an empire, but it is only one piece of the larger picture. Major world powers are forming blocs, new alliances are rising, and global trade patterns are reorganizing without the United States at the center. Countries that once relied on U.S. security guarantees are now building their own defense networks, investing in domestic manufacturing, and forming new monetary partnerships that bypass American influence entirely. Meanwhile, global trust in U.S. stability has been shaken by political turmoil, fiscal irresponsibility, and erratic foreign policy, and investors, governments, and corporations are treating America not as an unshakable superpower, but as a nation entering a period of volatility. Domestically, the consequences of this shift are becoming impossible to ignore. Rising costs, declining purchasing power, increased foreign competition, strained supply chains, and a fragile middle class being squeezed out of existence. The United States now carries over $38 trillion in national debt, and interest payments alone are higher than the entire military budget, a grotesque reversal of the fiscal fundamentals that once made America the safest bet on Earth. And here's the real punch. Intelligence analysts have begun openly acknowledging that the world is entering a multipolar fragmentation, meaning global power is breaking into competing spheres, and the U.S. must prepare for an era where it no longer dictates the rules but reacts to them. This is why the military is repositioning. This is why corporations are hedging. This is why financial systems are tightening. This is why the government is preparing silently. Because the biggest shift of all is already underway. America is transitioning from the world's anchor to one of many players, and that transition will affect every dollar you earn, every institution you rely on, and every assumption you have about the future.